Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome once more to Rainy Boring Reads. The world outside is softened by a persistent, gentle rain, each droplet a quiet percussion against the glass, against the roof, against the leaves. It's the kind of weather that invites introspection, a drawing inwards, a turning of pages both literal and metaphorical. And so, with the rain as our companion, let us embark on a rather extensive journey today. We shall open the time-worn book of history to a period that continues to fascinate and at times mystify, the Middle Ages. Spanning roughly a millennium, from the fading light of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the burgeoning dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th, this era was far from a monolithic block of darkness. Instead, it was a tapestry woven with threads of profound transformation, stark regional diversity, and a complex interplay of ancient traditions and emerging innovations. Our focus today will not be on the grand sweep of dynastic struggles or the clash of armies, though those certainly occurred. Rather, we shall endeavor to illuminate the more intimate, often overlooked, details of daily life and the intricate fabric of society, primarily within Western Europe. It is a challenging task to piece together the lives of people long gone, relying on the often fragmented records they left behind. The chronicles of monks, the archaeological whispers from buried villages, the silent testimony of art, and the echoes in literature. Two immense structures cast their long shadows across this medieval landscape, shaping nearly every facet of existence. The Christian Church, predominantly the Roman Catholic Church in the West, and the socio-economic system of feudalism, intertwined with manorialism. The Church was not merely a spiritual guide, it was an omnipresent force, political, economic, cultural, a unifier of disparate peoples under a common faith, its influence touching every soul from the moment of birth to the final breath. Feudalism, with its complex web of reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals, centered on land tenure and military service, structured the echelons of power. And manorialism, its agricultural heart, organized rural life around largely self-sufficient estates, defining the very existence of the vast peasant population. So settle in. Let the rhythm of the rain soothe your thoughts, and let us begin to explore this distant, yet profoundly influential world, starting with the very structure of its society. Medieval society, at its core, was conceived as hierarchical, often visualized through the prism of the three estates or orders. This was less a rigid caste system and more a divinely perceived arrangement where each group fulfilled specific, essential functions for the well-being of the whole. There were the orators, those who prayed, the clergy, the bellators, those who fought, the nobility, and the labrators, those who worked, the peasantry and other common folk. While this model provides a useful framework, it is, of course, a simplification of a reality that grew ever more complex, particularly with the later rise of a vibrant urban class. Let us first consider the orators, the first estate, the clergy. Theirs was a position of immense spiritual authority and, very often, considerable temporal power. Their primary sacred duty was prayer, to intercede with God on behalf of all Christendom, to minister to the spiritual needs of the flock. This estate was itself a deeply layered hierarchy. At its pinnacle, the Pope in Rome, believed to be the spiritual successor to St. Peter. Beneath him, cardinals, archbishops, and bishops governed vast dioceses, wielding significant influence. And then, at the grassroots, the humble parish priests, the direct spiritual shepherds of the laity. Within this order also lived the monks and nuns, dedicated souls dwelling in monastic communities, their lives governed by specific rules, the most renowned being the rule of Saint Benedict. Their days were a rhythm of prayer, labor, ora et labora, and scholarly pursuit. The Church was a colossal landowner. Through centuries of gifts, bequests, and strategic acquisitions, it had amassed vast estates, making it an economic powerhouse. Clerics were frequently the most literate individuals in society, their skills essential in the administrative machinery of royal courts and noble households. Monasteries, in particular, were beacons of learning and culture in a world where literacy was a rare gift. Within their often isolated walls, in quiet scriptoria, monks painstakingly copied ancient texts, classical and Christian, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to the tides of time. These monastic centers were also often at the forefront of agricultural innovation, land management, and even industries like brewing and winemaking. They provided charity in the form of alms for the poor, rudimentary care for the sick in their infirmaries, and hospitality for weary travelers and pilgrims. For the average person, the most immediate and tangible presence of the church was the parish priest. He was the one who welcomed infants into the Christian fold through baptism, who heard the whispered anxieties of confession, who sanctified unions in marriage, who administered the solemn last rites at the threshold of death, and who presided over burials in the consecrated ground of the churchyard. The parish church itself was more than just a building for worship. It was the true heart of village life, a focal point for social gatherings, the dissemination of news, and the celebration of religious festivals that marked the passage of the year. Next, we turn to the bellators, the second estate, the nobility. Their ordained role was to fight, to defend the Christian realm, its people, and its faith from external threats and internal disorder. This was the warrior class, its structure defined by the intricate bonds of feudalism. At the apex, at least in theory, stood the king, the ultimate sovereign. Below him ranged the powerful magnates, dukes, earls, counts, and barons, who held extensive lands, their fiefdoms granted by the king. In return, they pledged fealty, swearing solemn oaths of loyalty and promising military service, counsel, and financial aid. These great lords, in turn, would grant portions of their lands to lesser knights, the mounted warriors who formed the mailed fist of medieval armies. This system of vassalage, this personal bond between lord and man, was the sinew of feudal power. The life of the nobility, especially those of higher rank, revolved around the castle or the fortified manor house. These were not merely residences. They were formidable defensive structures, administrative centers for sprawling estates, and symbols of power and status. The noble lord was responsible for maintaining order and dispensing justice within his domain, and for leading his contingent of knights and men-at-arms in times of war. When not engaged in actual conflict, their leisure pursuits often mirrored the skills required for battle. Hunting, the chase of deer or boar through vast forests, was both a sport and a valuable source of food. Hawking with trained birds of prey was another favored pastime. And then there were the tournaments, elaborate and often dangerous mock battles, where knights could display their prowess, win renown, and hone their martial skills. Emerging from this warrior ethos was the ideal of chivalry, a code of conduct that, at least in its purest form, espoused virtues such as courage, loyalty, honor, courtesy, and the protection of the vulnerable, particularly women and the church. While the reality often fell short of this lofty ideal, chivalry profoundly shaped medieval culture, art, and literature, giving rise to epic tales of valor and romance. Noble women, though existing within a profoundly patriarchal society, were far from passive figures. They bore the immense responsibility of managing large and complex households, often overseeing vast estates with remarkable competence, especially when their husbands were absent on campaign or at court. Their marriages were frequently strategic alliances, designed to consolidate power, acquire land, or forge peace between rival families. While their legal autonomy was generally limited, some noble women, particularly as powerful widows or as regents for young heirs, could wield considerable influence and navigate the treacherous currents of medieval politics with astute skill. They were often educated, at least to a degree, in literacy, music, and the intricate etiquette of courtly life. And finally, we come to the labrators, the third estate, those who work. This group constituted the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, perhaps as much as 80 to 90%. It was their unceasing toil, their sweat and labor, that sustained the other two estates, that fed the mouths of priests and nobles alike. The peasantry was not a homogeneous mass. Crucial distinctions existed, most notably between serfs and freemen. Serfs were unfree laborers, bound to the land they cultivated. This land belonged not to them, but to the lord of the manor. They could not leave the manor, marry, or even dispose of their meager personal property without the lord's explicit permission. They owed the lord a range of obligations, labor services, known as week work, performed on the lord's own fields, the domain, for a set number of days each week. They also owed him a significant portion of the produce from their own allotted strips of land, a rent paid in kind grain, livestock, eggs, honey. And there were numerous other dues, taxes, and fines that could be levied. Freemen, while still typically tenants on the lord's land, possessed greater personal liberty. Their obligations were usually less onerous, often commuted to cash payments rather than labor service, and they had more freedom of movement. The daily life of the peasantry was organized around the manorial system. The manor was, in essence, a self-sufficient agricultural estate. It typically comprised the lord's domain, the peasant's individual holdings, often scattered strips in vast, open, communally farmed fields. Common pastureland where villagers could graze their livestock, woodland for foraging and timber, and the village itself, clustered around the parish church and perhaps a manor house. The agricultural calendar, the relentless cycle of plowing, sowing, tending, and harvesting, dictated the very rhythm of peasant existence. Their lives were perpetually subject to the whims of nature. The weather, the threat of crop failure due to drought or blight, the scourge of animal diseases. Famine was a constant, lurking fear. Yet, within these often harsh confines, village communities developed strong bonds of cooperation and mutual support, essential for collective survival in a challenging world. They shared tools, helped each other during illness or misfortune, and celebrated life's milestones together. But the social landscape of the Middle Ages was not static. From the 11th century onwards, a significant shift began to occur: the resurgence and steady growth of towns and cities. These urban centers, some newly founded, others reviving ancient Roman settlements, became magnets for people seeking opportunities beyond the rigid confines of the manorial system. This fostered the rise of a dynamic new class: the burghers or townsfolk, merchants, and skilled artisans, who did not fit neatly into the traditional tripartite model of society. Towns often grew organically around existing fortifications, influential monasteries, or at strategic locations for trade, river crossings, natural harbors, or the intersection of important overland routes. Artisans, the skilled craftsmen, formed the productive heart of these urban communities. Weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, bakers, masons, coopers, each trade had its specialists. They soon began to organize themselves into guilds. These guilds were multifaceted organizations. They rigorously regulated the quality of goods produced, ensuring standards and protecting the reputation of their craft. They set prices, controlled entry into the trade through a structured system of apprenticeship, a long period of learning under a master craftsman, followed by a phase as a journeyman, working for wages, with the ultimate goal of achieving master status and opening one's own workshop. Guilds also provided mutual support for their members in times of illness or hardship, and often played a very significant role in town governance, their leaders sitting on town councils. Merchants were the lifeblood of urban prosperity, engaged in commerce at various scales. Local markets, often held weekly, provided a vital link between town and countryside, where peasants could sell their surplus produce and purchase crafted goods or necessities they couldn't produce themselves. Larger regional fairs, held annually or semi-annually, attracted merchants from much further afield, becoming vibrant hubs for the exchange of a wider array of commodities: textiles, livestock, wine, salt, metals. And then there was long-distance trade, connecting Europe to the wider world. Powerful merchant organizations like the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe, or the great maritime republics of Italy like Venice and Genoa, facilitated the flow of luxury goods. Silks from the east, spices from distant islands, fine wines, furs, and other exotic wares. As these towns and cities grew in wealth and population, their inhabitants, the burghers, increasingly sought greater autonomy from the traditional authority of feudal lords or bishops, upon whose land the town might originally have been established. They petitioned for, and sometimes fought for, charters of liberty. These charters granted them significant rights: the right to self-government through elected mayors and councils, the ability to levy their own taxes, to establish their own courts of law, and to regulate their own economic affairs. A strong sense of civic pride began to emerge in these bustling, often crowded, and increasingly independent urban centers. Of course, no society is without its margins, and medieval Europe was no exception. Alongside the ordered estates and the rising urban classes, there existed those who lived on the fringes, the outcasts and the marginalized. Poverty was endemic, and beggars were a common sight in towns and along pilgrimage routes, their existence dependent on the alms of the faithful, often dispensed by monastic orders or pious individuals. Those afflicted with dreaded diseases, most notably leprosy, faced profound ostracism. Feared as contagious and sometimes seen as divinely punished, lepers were often compelled to live in segregated communities, known as leper houses or lazar houses, typically situated outside town walls. They might be required to wear distinctive clothing or carry a bell or clapper to warn others of their approach, a poignant symbol of their exclusion. Jewish communities were a persistent, often precarious, presence in many parts of medieval Europe. Frequently restricted by law from owning land or joining the mainstream craft guilds, they often specialized in occupations that Christians were discouraged from or forbidden to engage in, most notably moneylending. As the Church's prohibition on usury, lending money at interest, applied to Christians, Jews filled a vital, if often resented, economic niche, providing credit to nobles, merchants, and even kings. This role, however, made them vulnerable. They lived as a distinct minority, often confined to specific quarters within towns, subject to discriminatory laws, periodic outbreaks of violent persecution, and in some regions and times, wholesale expulsions. Their story is one of remarkable resilience and cultural continuity in the face of persistent adversity. And then there were those deemed heretics, individuals or groups whose beliefs deviated from the officially sanctioned doctrines of the Church. As the Church consolidated its power and sought to enforce doctrinal uniformity, particularly from the High Middle Ages onwards, accusations of heresy became a serious matter. Those found guilty faced severe condemnation, ranging from public penance and excommunication, which effectively cut them off from the Christian community and its sacraments, to imprisonment, confiscation of property, and in the most extreme cases, execution, often by burning at the stake. The pursuit of heretics, through institutions like the Inquisition, underscores the immense pressure for conformity in a society where religious belief was so deeply interwoven with the social and political order. These marginalized groups, in their various ways, highlight the boundaries, the anxieties, and the sometimes brutal enforcement mechanisms of medieval society. Having sketched the broad outlines of medieval social structure, let us now draw closer to try and perceive the very rhythm of daily existence, particularly for that vast majority, the peasantry. Their lives were profoundly intertwined with the natural world, governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the ceaseless turning of the agricultural seasons. Imagine first the peasant's dwelling, the humble abode that offered shelter. These were rarely the picturesque, sturdy stone cottages that grace romantic paintings. For most, home was a far more rudimentary affair. The materials used were those readily available from the surrounding environment. Timber-framed structures were common, the spaces between the timbers filled with wattle and daub, a practical, if not particularly durable, composite of woven wooden strips, wattle, plastered with a sticky mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung daub. Roofs were typically thatched with straw, reeds, or heather, materials that provided reasonable insulation but required constant maintenance and were vulnerable to fire. The floor beneath their feet was most often simply beaten earth. This would be dusty in dry weather and unpleasantly damp, even muddy, during wet spells. Windows, if the dwelling possessed them at all, were small, unglazed apertures. They might be covered with wooden shutters to keep out the cold or the night, or perhaps with stretched animal hide, scraped thin to translucency, or even pieces of linen cloth soaked in oil. These offered a dim, filtered light at best, and little protection from drafts. Step inside, and the space would likely feel cramped, dark, and smoky. A typical peasant home might consist of just 1 or 2 rooms. It's a stark image for us to conjure, but it was not uncommon for the family to share this limited living space with their most valuable livestock, a cow, a few sheep, or pigs, especially during the harsh winter months. The body heat of the animals, while adding to the general aroma and hygiene challenges, was a vital, free source of warmth. Furnishings were minimal, dictated by necessity and poverty. A rough-hewn trestle table, perhaps designed to be easily dismantled and stored against a wall to create more space. A few simple benches or stools. A wooden chest, perhaps, to store the family's few clothes, tools, or other meager possessions. And for sleeping, straw-filled pallets or mattresses, laid directly on the earthen floor. Often, several family members would share these, huddling together for warmth against the pervasive chill. At the very heart of this humble dwelling, both literally and figuratively, was the hearth. In the simplest homes, this might be nothing more than an open fire pit in the center of the main room. The smoke from this fire, burning wood or peat, would find its way out through a deliberately left hole in the thatched roof, or simply seep through the eaves and any gaps in the walls. Imagine the air inside, perpetually hazy with smoke, stinging the eyes, coating every surface with a layer of soot. Yet, this hearth was the epicenter of domestic life. It provided the sole source of heat for cooking the family's daily meals. It offered a small, vital circle of warmth against the biting cold of winter. And it cast a flickering, uncertain light against the profound darkness of the medieval night, once the sun had set. More substantial peasant homes, or those built later in the period, might feature a hearth built against a stone or clay-lined wall, perhaps with a rudimentary smoke hood made of wattle and plaster, designed to guide some of the smoke upwards. But proper chimneys, as we know them, were a later development, and initially a luxury confined to the homes of the wealthy or monastic buildings. That ever-present wood smoke, for all its discomfort, did serve some secondary purposes. It helped to cure and preserve any strips of meat or fish that might be hung in the rafters, imparting a smoky flavor. And some believed it helped to deter insects and vermin. Now, let us try to follow the peasant family through the course of a typical day. Their day began with the very first faint gray light of dawn. There were no alarm clocks, no artificial schedules beyond the sun's arc. And their day would not end until the last vestiges of sunlight had faded from the western sky. Artificial lighting, in the form of tallow candles made from animal fat, or smoky, sputtering rushlights, reeds dipped in fat, was a precious and relatively expensive commodity, to be used sparingly, usually only when absolutely necessary. The entire family unit operated as an indivisible economic enterprise. Every able-bodied member, from the smallest child capable of performing simple tasks to the aging grandparent still able to contribute in some way, played a part in the collective struggle for survival. The men's work was predominantly agricultural, and it was relentlessly physical. Picture them in the fields, from sunup to sundown, guiding the heavy plow, often drawn by a team of slow, plodding oxen, its iron share laboriously turning over the dense soil. Sowing the precious seed by hand, a rhythmic scattering across the prepared earth. Harrowing the fields to cover the seed. Then came the endless, back-breaking task of weeding, often done by hand or with simple hoes, under the heat of the summer sun. And then the crucial, culminating effort of the harvest, reaping the ripened grain, wheat, rye, barley, oats, with curved sickles or long-handled scythes. This was a period of intense communal labor, where every available hand was needed. Once cut, the grain had to be bundled into sheaves, transported from the fields, and then threshed, beaten with flails to separate the edible kernels from the stalks and chaff. Beyond the fields, the men's responsibilities continued. Tending to the livestock, the vital draft oxen, perhaps a few cattle for milk or meat, the ubiquitous pigs that foraged for sustenance. Repairing tools, which were precious and often handed down through generations. Mending fences to keep animals in or out. Maintaining the simple structure of their dwelling. And the constant, essential task of cutting firewood from the Lord's woodlands, with permission of course, or digging peat from bogs for fuel for the hearth. For those peasants who were serfs, there was the additional, unavoidable obligation of performing labor services on the Lord's own domain land for a stipulated number of days each week, or during specific seasons like plowing or harvest. This was labor for which they received no direct payment, a fundamental part of their tenancy. And what of the women? Their work was equally arduous, equally essential, a ceaseless round of tasks that underpinned the family's existence. Their primary domain was often the home and its immediate surroundings, but their labor extended far beyond. Central to their day was the preparation of food. This often revolved around a single, large cooking pot, suspended over the hearth, in which a perpetual pottage or stew would simmer. This would be a thick, nourishing concoction of grains, oats, barley, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables were available from the kitchen garden, onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots. Meat, if available, would be a flavoring rather than a central ingredient. Baking bread was another vital task. If the family did not have its own small oven, a luxury, they might use a communal village oven, often controlled by the lord of the manor, for which a small fee or portion of the flour might be charged. The bread itself was typically dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains, providing a substantial part of their caloric intake. Brewing ale was also a common female responsibility. Ale, usually made from barley, was the staple drink for everyone, including children. It was generally safer to drink than water, which could often be contaminated, and it provided additional calories. Fetching that water, often from a distant village well, stream, or spring, was another daily chore, involving heavy lifting and carrying. Then there were the endless domestic tasks, cleaning the simple dwelling as best one could, given the earthen floors and smoky atmosphere, mending worn clothing, patching and repatching garments to extend their life. And of course, the constant demanding and loving care of children, feeding, cleaning, comforting, and supervising them. But the peasant woman's work did not stop at the cottage door. She would typically tend a small kitchen garden, often called a croft or toft, attached to their dwelling. Here, she would cultivate vegetables and herbs, essential for supplementing the family's diet and for traditional remedies. She would also usually be responsible for caring for the poultry, chickens, geese, ducks, which provided precious eggs and occasional meat. If the family owned a cow or a few goats, milking them would also fall to her. Crucially, women were not exempt from fieldwork. They participated actively in many agricultural tasks, especially during peak seasons like planting, weeding, and, most notably, the harvest. During the grain harvest, every available hand, male or female, young or old, was desperately needed to bring in the crop before it spoiled or was damaged by weather. And in the quieter moments, perhaps in the evenings by the dim light of the fire, or during lulls in other work, her hands would rarely be idle. Spinning wool or flax into thread, using a simple drop spindle or, later, a spinning wheel, was a near-constant activity. This thread would then be woven, often on a simple loom within the home, into coarse but durable cloth for the family's clothing. These were skills passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation, essential for clothing the family and sometimes for producing a small surplus to trade or sell. And the children? In this world, childhood as a distinct period of protected innocence and play, as we understand it, was a much shorter and often harsher experience. Children were integrated into the family's workforce from a very young age, as soon as they were physically capable of contributing. The smallest children might be given tasks such as scaring birds away from newly sown fields or ripening crops. Their small shouts and gestures a constant presence in the agricultural landscape. They would collect firewood, fallen fruit, or edible weeds. They would help fetch water in smaller containers. Their learning was experiential, absorbed through observation and practice. And so, the peasant's day would unfold, a relentless cycle of labor, dictated by the position of the sun and the demands of the season. Meals would be simple, often eaten in the fields during busy times or around the hearth. There was a rhythm to this life, a deep and abiding connection to the land, to the turning of the year. It was a life of immense hardship, vulnerability, and often monotony, viewed from our modern perspective. Yet, within it, there was also a profound sense of community, of shared struggle, of simple joys taken in moments of respite, and a testament to human resilience and endurance. As dusk began to creep across the landscape, painting the sky in deepening shades of gray and purple, the peasant family would gather once more within the smoky confines of their dwelling. They would be expected to mind even younger siblings, freeing their mother for other, more demanding tasks. As they grew older, their responsibilities would increase, mirroring those of their parents. Boys would learn the skills of farming from their fathers, how to handle the plow, sow the seed, tend the livestock, use and repair tools. Girls would learn the myriad skills of the household and garden from their mothers: cooking, baking, brewing, spinning, weaving, preserving food, caring for children, and assisting with lighter agricultural tasks. Play certainly existed in snatched moments between chores, simple games with found objects, running, wrestling, perhaps a rough-hewn doll or a carved wooden animal. But work, and the expectation of contributing to the family's survival, was the defining characteristic of their young lives. Education, in the formal sense of literacy and numeracy, was almost entirely absent for peasant children. The tools would be carefully cleaned and put away, the animals secured for the night. The final embers of the fire would glow, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough walls. And then sleep, a rest hard-earned, a temporary reprieve, before the sun rose again to signal the start of another day, a day that would, in all likelihood, be remarkably similar to the one that had just passed. This was the unceasing, ancient rhythm of life for the vast majority of people who inhabited the medieval world. A quiet, often unrecorded, drama of toil and tenacity, played out day after day, season after season, year after year, under the vast, often indifferent sky. while the daily life of the medieval peasant was often intensely localized. Revolving around the manor and the village, individuals and communities were not entirely isolated. A wider world existed, a network of connections, however tenuous or challenging to navigate. The village itself was a complex social organism, and beyond its boundaries lay the burgeoning towns and the roads and waterways that, however imperfectly, linked them. Let us first consider the village community in more detail. It was far more than just a geographical cluster of dwellings. It was a tightly knit social and economic unit, bound by shared work, mutual obligations, and a collective identity. Interdependence was not merely a virtue, it was an absolute necessity for survival. The open field system of agriculture, prevalent in many parts of Europe, exemplified this. Under this system, the arable land of the manor was divided into several large, unenclosed fields. Each peasant family was allocated a number of strips of land, often scattered across these different fields, rather than consolidated in one block. This arrangement, while seemingly inefficient to modern eyes, had its reasons. It ensured a fairer distribution of different qualities of land and helped to mitigate the risk of a single localized disaster, like hail or pest infestation, wiping out a family's entire crop. However, it also necessitated a high degree of cooperation. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting had to be coordinated. Decisions about crop rotation, which fields to plant with which crops, and which to leave fallow to recover fertility, had to be made collectively. The timing of when livestock could be grazed on the stubble of harvested fields or on the common pasture land was also a matter for communal agreement. This fostered a strong sense of shared endeavor and mutual reliance. At the very heart of the village, both physically and spiritually, stood the parish church. We have touched upon its role, but it bears re-emphasizing. It was the undisputed center of religious life, the place where villagers attended Mass, received the essential sacraments that marked the passages of life: baptism, confirmation, marriage, the Eucharist, extreme unction, last rites, and where they laid their dead to rest in the consecrated ground of the adjoining churchyard. But the church's significance extended far beyond the purely spiritual. It was also a primary social hub. The church porch or the churchyard often served as a place for meetings, for the dissemination of local news and official announcements, for the settlement of minor disputes. Church Alash, festive gatherings often held in the church house or churchyard, where ale brewed for the occasion was sold to raise funds for the upkeep of the church or for charitable purposes, were important communal events, fostering social cohesion and providing welcome breaks from toil. The village green, or a designated area of common land, was another focal point for community life. This land was typically used for grazing the villagers' livestock. It might also be the site for local markets or small fairs, for games and sports, for dances and other communal celebrations, particularly on religious feast days. Order, such as it was, within the village, and the manor was often maintained through the manorial court. Presided over by the lord of the manor or his appointed steward, this court dealt with local disputes between villagers, enforced the customary laws of the manor, regulated the use of common resources, and collected fines for infractions. While its justice could be summary and heavily weighted in favor of the lord, it provided a mechanism for resolving conflicts and maintaining a degree of social control. In such small, close-knit communities, gossip and reputation were incredibly powerful forces. Everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. A person standing within the village, their perceived honesty, diligence, and piety, could significantly affect their daily interactions and their ability to secure help from neighbors in times of need. Social conformity was highly valued, and deviation from accepted norms could lead to ostracism or censure. Now, let us shift our gaze from the rural village to the more dynamic and often more chaotic environment of the medieval town. Life in these burgeoning urban centers presented a stark contrast to the agricultural rhythms of the countryside. Towns were magnets, drawing in people from surrounding areas, runaway serfs seeking freedom, as many towns offered freedom to a serf who could reside there for a year and a day without being reclaimed by their lord. Younger sons of peasants with no land to inherit, artisans seeking markets for their skills, and merchants pursuing profit. The physical layout of a medieval town was often characterized by its defensive needs. Many towns were enclosed by substantial stone walls, punctuated by fortified gates that would be closed at night or in times of danger. Within these walls, the streets were typically narrow, winding, and unpaved. They would turn to mud in wet weather and dust in dry. Houses were built close together, often with upper stories that jettied out over the street below, further restricting light and air circulation. This dense, organic growth pattern, while picturesque to modern eyes, created significant challenges. The marketplace, or several marketplaces, formed the vibrant heart of urban commerce. Here, on designated market days, often once or twice a week, goods from the surrounding countryside, grains, livestock, dairy products, firewood, would be brought in for sale. Town-based artisans would also sell their wares: shoes, tools, pottery, textiles. Larger towns often hosted annual or semi-annual fairs, which attracted merchants from distant regions, even from other countries, transforming the town into a bustling international emporium for a few weeks, with exotic goods, entertainers, and a general air of excitement. Craftsmen in towns often congregated in specific streets or quarters, which sometimes became named after their particular trade. One might find a Baker Street, a Tanner Row, or a Goldsmith's Alley. This clustering facilitated the sharing of specialized knowledge, access to raw materials, and a sense of professional identity. Urban dwellings differed significantly from rural cottages. To accommodate a growing population within the confines of the town walls, houses were often built upwards, with multiple stories. The ground floor might be occupied by a workshop or shop, open to the street, with the family's living quarters on the floors above. Construction materials varied, but timber framing was common, with infill of wattle and daub, plaster, or, in wealthier structures, brick or stone. Fire was a constant and terrifying hazard in these densely packed environments of wood and thatch, and major conflagrations could devastate entire sections of a town. Sanitation, or rather the lack thereof, was a major challenge in most medieval towns. Overcrowding exacerbated the problems of waste disposal. Household waste, including food scraps and ashes, was often simply thrown into the streets. Gutters, if they existed, were often open channels running down the middle or sides of the street, carrying away rainwater and much else besides. Human waste disposal was rudimentary. Some houses had privies or garderobes, which were essentially latrine chutes built into the side of the building, emptying into a cesspit below, or sometimes directly into a nearby river or the town ditch that ran outside the walls. The streets would have been fouled by animal dung from horses, oxen, pigs, and poultry that roamed freely. The cumulative effect of all this was an olfactory experience that would likely be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. The smell of a medieval city, a potent mix of wood smoke, animal waste, decaying refuse, and the odors of various trades like tanning, which used pungent chemicals, would have been pervasive. Unsurprisingly, these conditions contributed to the spread of disease. Despite these challenges, towns were also centers of innovation, opportunity, and a growing civic consciousness. As we noted earlier, town governance evolved with mayors, aldermen, and town councils, often dominated by wealthy merchants and master craftsmen, managing the affairs of the community. A strong sense of urban identity and pride began to develop, with towns competing with each other in wealth, influence, and the grandeur of their public buildings, particularly their cathedrals or principal churches. And what of movement between these villages and towns, between different regions? Travel in the Middle Ages was generally slow, arduous, and often fraught with danger. The extensive network of paved Roman roads had, in many places, fallen into disrepair through centuries of neglect. Medieval roads were frequently little more than unpaved tracks, turning into muddy quagmires in wet weather and deeply rutted and dusty in dry conditions. Bridges were scarce and often poorly maintained. River crossings frequently relied on fords or ferries. The most common mode of travel for ordinary people was simply walking. Merchants, nobles, and wealthier clergy might travel on horseback, which was considerably faster. Goods were transported laboriously in slow-moving, ox-drawn or horse-drawn carts and wagons. Water travel, where available, was often preferred for transporting bulky goods, as it was generally cheaper and smoother than overland routes. Rivers and coastal shipping lanes formed important arteries of commerce and communication. The dangers of medieval travel were manifold. Bandits and outlaws often lurked in forests or remote areas, preying on unsuspecting travelers. Wild animals, such as wolves or bears, still roamed in less populated regions. The roads themselves could be treacherous, with hazards like sudden floods or collapsing bridges. Consequently, people often preferred to travel in groups for mutual protection. Inns and hospices provided essential shelter and sustenance for those on the road. Inns were commercial establishments offering food, drink, and a place to sleep, often in communal dormitories. Their quality varied enormously. Hospices, frequently run by monastic orders or charitable foundations, offered similar services, often specifically for pilgrims or the poor and sick. Pilgrimage was a major form of travel in the Middle Ages and a powerful expression of religious devotion. Pious Christians undertook long and often perilous journeys to sacred sites, believed to be imbued with spiritual power. The most important international pilgrimage destinations were Jerusalem, the Holy Land, Rome, the seat of the papacy and site of the martyrdoms of Saints Peter and Paul, and Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, believed to be the burial place of Saint James the Apostle. For most people, news from beyond their immediate locality would arrive sporadically, often distorted or outdated, adding to a sense of a world that was both vast and largely unknown. Countless local and regional shrines also attracted pilgrims, often dedicated to particular saints or possessing holy relics. These journeys, undertaken by people from all walks of life, fostered a sense of shared Christian identity across Europe and facilitated the exchange of news, ideas, and cultural influences. The dissemination of news and information was, by modern standards, incredibly slow and unreliable. There were no newspapers, no telegraph, no internet. News traveled primarily by word of mouth. Official messengers on horseback carried letters and decrees for kings, nobles, and the church. Merchants, traveling along trade routes, brought news from distant parts. Minstrels, troubadours, and other traveling entertainers also served as carriers of news, songs, and stories, moving from village to town, from castle to fair. Having explored the broader social structures and the nature of communities, let us now turn our attention to the most fundamental unit of medieval society, the family. Within the family, individuals were born, raised, married, and eventually cared for in old age. It was the primary institution for emotional support, economic production, and the transmission of values and traditions. The concept and purpose of marriage in the Middle Ages differed in significant ways from modern romantic ideals, although affection and companionship were certainly not absent. For all social classes, but particularly for the nobility and wealthier commoners, marriage was primarily an economic and social alliance. Its main purposes were the orderly transfer of property, land, wealth titles, the formation of strategic alliances between families, and, crucially, the procreation of legitimate heirs to continue the family lineage and inherit its possessions. The dowry, the property or wealth a bride brought to her husband's family, and the dower, the portion of a husband's property set aside for his wife's support should she be widowed, were critical components of marriage negotiations. Arranged marriages were the norm, especially among the landed and affluent classes. Parents or guardians would negotiate matches for their children, often when the children were still very young, based on considerations of wealth, status, and political advantage. While the church theoretically required the consent of both individuals for a marriage to be valid, this consent could often be influenced by considerable family pressure or societal expectation. Romantic love, as the primary basis for marriage, was a concept that would gain more prominence in later periods, though personal affection could, and often did, develop within arranged unions. Medieval literature, from chivalric romances to more popular ballads, certainly attests to the power of love and desire, even if it wasn't always the formal prerequisite for matrimony. The typical family structure was the nuclear family, a husband, wife, and their children living together as a household unit. However, extended family ties, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, remained very important, providing a wider network of support, obligation, and identity. Medieval society was overwhelmingly patriarchal. The husband, as head of the household, held legal and social authority over his wife and children. His responsibilities included providing for the family, managing its property, and representing it in the wider community. The role of women within this patriarchal framework was complex and varied considerably according to social class. In the growing towns, women were also active participants in economic life. They frequently worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, as shopkeepers, artisans, or traders. Widows, in particular, often had more legal and economic autonomy and could continue to run their deceased husband's business, sometimes becoming successful entrepreneurs in their own right. Certain trades, such as brewing, baking, and textile production, were often dominated by women. For some women, the monastic life offered an alternative path. Joining a convent provided an opportunity for education, spiritual devotion, and a degree of autonomy and security outside the traditional confines of marriage and family. Nunneries could be important centers of learning, manuscript production, and charitable work. However, despite these varied roles and contributions, the legal status of women in medieval society was generally subordinate to that of men. Noble women, as we have touched upon, often managed large and intricate households, supervised estates, and bore the critical responsibility of producing male heirs to secure the family line. They could be influential figures, particularly in the arrangement of marriages for their children or as conduits for dynastic alliances. Many noble women received some form of education, including literacy, music, and the social graces necessary for courtly life. Peasant women, who formed the vast majority, were indispensable economic partners in the family unit. Their lives were characterized by unceasing labor, both domestic and agricultural. They were responsible for childcare, food preparation, brewing, spinning, weaving, tending the kitchen garden and poultry, and often assisting with heavy fieldwork, especially during planting and harvest. Their contributions were absolutely vital to the survival and functioning of the peasant household. They typically had limited property rights, especially married women whose property often came under the control of their husbands. In law, they were often considered dependents, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. Yet, within these constraints, many medieval women found ways to exert influence, demonstrate resilience, and shape their own lives and the lives of their families. Let us now consider childhood and education in the medieval world. The experience of being a child was, in many ways, starkly different from modern conceptions. Perhaps the most profound difference was the pervasive reality of high infant and child mortality rates. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and a limited understanding of hygiene and medicine meant that many children did not survive their early years. This harsh reality undoubtedly shaped emotional attachments and parental attitudes, though grief for a lost child was, of course, deeply felt. Children were integrated into the world of work from a very young age. As soon as they were physically capable, they were expected to contribute to the family economy, performing tasks appropriate to their age and strength, as we have previously discussed. This early introduction to labor meant that the period of childhood, as a distinct, carefree phase of life, was relatively short, especially for the peasantry. Despite the hardships and the early assumption of responsibilities, children did play. Archaeological finds and manuscript illuminations depict children engaged in various games. Playing with simple dolls made of cloth or wood, rolling hoops, spinning tops, playing with balls, engaging in mock fights with sticks, or playing with animal knucklebones, used like dice. Play was often informal, utilizing found objects and imagination, and occurred in the brief moments of respite from chores. Formal education was a privilege available to a relatively small segment of the population. For the vast majority of peasant children, education was almost entirely informal and practical. They learned by observing and imitating their parents and other adults in the village, acquiring the skills necessary for farming, domestic work, and basic crafts. Literacy was extremely rare among the peasantry. For the children of the nobility, education was geared towards their future roles. Boys would typically be sent away from home at a young age, perhaps around 7, to serve as pages in the household of another noble family. There, they would learn courtly manners, basic literacy, music, and the rudiments of warfare. In their teens, they might become squires, directly serving a knight, learning horsemanship, the use of weapons, and the code of chivalry, in preparation for eventually becoming knights themselves. Girls of noble birth were usually educated at home, or sometimes in a convent. Their education would focus on domestic management, needlework, music, dancing, and perhaps literacy and basic numeracy, all designed to prepare them for marriage and running a noble household. The church played a crucial role in providing more formal education. Monastic schools and cathedral schools primarily educated boys and young men destined for a clerical career, teaching them Latin, theology, and other subjects necessary for religious life. Some of these schools also admitted a limited number of lay students. In the growing towns, the demand for literacy and numeracy for commercial purposes led to the establishment of town schools or guild schools, often providing a more practical education for the sons of merchants and artisans. And then there were the universities, which began to emerge and flourish from the 12th century onwards. Great centers of higher learning like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. These institutions attracted scholars and students from across Europe, offering advanced study in theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. University education, however, was accessible only to a very small, privileged, and exclusively male elite. Finally, let us consider the later stages of life, old age, and the ever-present reality of death. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was generally much lower than it is today, often cited as being in the 30s or 40s on average. However, this low average was heavily skewed by the extremely high rates of infant and child mortality. If an individual survived the perilous early years of childhood and young adulthood, they had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s, 60s, or even beyond, though reaching what we would now consider advanced old age was less common. The care of the elderly typically fell to their families. It was expected that adult children would look after their aging parents, providing them with food, shelter, and support. In a society without formal pension systems or widespread state welfare, family was the primary safety net. For those without family, or whose families were unable to provide care, some charitable institutions, such as almshouses or hospitals, in their original sense of places of hospitality, often run by religious orders or endowed by wealthy patrons, might offer refuge and basic sustenance for the aged and infirm poor. Attitudes towards death were shaped by the pervasive influence of Christian belief. The location of the grave within the churchyard, or even within the church itself for the very wealthy or prominent, could reflect social status. Wealthier individuals might also make provisions in their wills for chantries, endowments to pay priests to say masses regularly for the repose of their soul, reflecting the strong belief in the efficacy of prayers for the dead to shorten their time in purgatory. The medieval world was one where death was a frequent and visible presence. Epidemic diseases, famine, warfare, and accidents meant that people were familiar with mortality from a young age. This constant proximity to death profoundly shaped their worldview, their religious practices, and their understanding of the human condition. A life that was seen as a pilgrimage, a temporary sojourn on the path to an eternal destiny. Death was not seen as an absolute end, but rather as a transition to the afterlife, to heaven, hell, or, according to evolving theological understanding, purgatory, a place of temporary purification for souls not yet fit for heaven. The fear of sudden, unprepared death was strong. A good death was one that was anticipated, allowing time for confession of sins, receiving the last sacraments of the Church, viaticum, anointing of the sick, and making peace with God and with one's family and community. Funerals and burials were important religious and social rituals. The body would typically be washed and shrouded, then carried in procession to the parish church for a funeral mass, before being buried in the consecrated ground of the churchyard. And so, dear listeners, our extended journey through the daily life and society of the medieval world begins to draw towards its close, at least for today. We have wandered through the structured estates of clergy, nobility, and peasantry, glimpsed the burgeoning energy of towns, and observed the intimate rhythms of family life, from the hearthside to the grave. It was a world of stark contrasts, of profound faith and brutal violence, of exquisite artistry and widespread hardship, of tight-knit communities and deep social divisions. The lives of those who inhabited this era were shaped by forces both immense and intimate, by the doctrines of the Church, the demands of feudal lords, the rhythms of the agricultural year, and the bonds of family and community. It is easy, from our modern vantage point, to view the Middle Ages through a lens of condescension, focusing on its perceived backwardness or brutality. But to do so is to miss the richness, the complexity, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit that characterized this long and transformative period. The people of the Middle Ages faced challenges we can scarcely imagine, yet they built cathedrals that still inspire awe, developed legal and political systems that laid foundations for our own, created works of art and literature that continue to speak to us, and day by day lived, loved, worked, and endured. The echoes of their world are still with us, in our languages, our institutions, our landscapes, and in the very fabric of our Western heritage. The rain, perhaps, is still falling as you listen, a timeless sound that connects us, across the centuries, to those who also sheltered from its embrace, who listened to its rhythm, and who lived out their lives under the same sky. Thank you for your patient company on this rather lengthy exploration with Rainy Boring Reads. We hope this tapestry of medieval life has offered some moments of quiet contemplation, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the distant past that has so profoundly shaped our present. Until our next story, may your thoughts be serene, and may the gentle sounds of the world around you bring peace.